The gates of KragfyrdHold. General Magos Ductora Cogitatus Tiberius stood at the gates of the last standing squat hold. His pet wargs, Thenkung, Daemung, and Wurkung, paced restlessly around him, their keen noses twitching at the scent of approaching Xenos. The squat warriors nearby watched the creatures with wary eyes, their hands never straying far from their weapons. The ground beneath Tiberius's armored boots trembled, as though a small earthquake rumbled beneath the soil. But he knew better. It was the footfalls of the Hālgengas war titans, their immense bioforms moving as one, shaking the earth with every step. Since his alpha had dispatched Bornwolf to locate the squat leader, his Skitarii scouts had confirmed what his calculations had already suspected. The Hālgengas were massing. Their huge bio-titans, their endless ranks of Thornborn, and their twisting forest wombs now controlled all routes to the hold. The final siege was about to begin. Tiberius turned his gaze to the defenders. The squats manned the outer fortifications around the bridge, their sturdy figures clad in yellow power armor, grim-faced and resolute. Along the main road leading to the hold, his Skitarii cohorts had taken optimal firing positions, ready to unleash devastating volleys at range. Between the hold and the bridge, the Wigathan survivors held the trench line, their numbers greatly diminished. With their officers fallen, Beornwulf had assumed command of what remained of the expeditionary force. Tiberius's optics focused on the bridge ahead. Halfway across, he saw Beornwulf standing beside King Thrangrim, the two warriors locked in quiet conversation, alone among the wreckage. It had been a long time since Tiberius had seen the Hlaford of Silthdale. Not since they had been on an expedition to the Geofon Brick station. After that, Beornwulf and his men had been assigned to the Novice Astra Wigathene as ground pounders. He had grown into a capable warrior and leader, showing just how good Voratrix was at choosing her pawns in her long drawn-out games of strategy. Beornwulf was an unusual man for a human. He naturally commanded in battle, yet never sought power. He inspired those around him, but not in the way great generals or noble lords did. No, it was something else, a certainty, an unshakable presence that gave men confidence. Even his alpha had taken to him. Tiberius studied him for a long moment, then turned his optics skyward. Above, the thunderheads shook with unnatural violence. The small fleet of Novice Astra Wigathene warships held their defensive blockade, preventing the Hālgengas bioships from bombarding the planet again or deploying more troops. According to NihtWyrtha's intelligence reports, more Hālgengas ships were on their way. Perhaps this battle was already lost. Perhaps it was pointless. However, Tiberius had sworn an oath to the dead king. By the logic of the Mechanicus, he was not bound to it, but by the contradictions within his own mind, he could not break it. It had been the same on Drakendelve, when he had risked his fleet to evacuate the Beastmen, earning the wrath of imperial commanders and his own archmagos. Years before, when he first came to NihtWyrtha, he had sworn an oath to the Beastman king, and he had kept it. And because of that, the Orc War had been won. He looked to his wargs, their ears flat, their muscles tense. They snapped at the air, tasting the pollen-slicked breath of the approaching Hālgengas. They knew what was coming. Tiberius let out a slow, mechanical breath. He would keep his oath, and he would live or die by it. Omnissiah, forgive him. It was time. He turned and marched towards the old observatory building where he would await events. Unchosen path. King Thrangrim leaned on his father's axe. He had not yet had time to think of it as his axe. He had only been king for a few hours, and he had no idea how to be one. The wind rose from the valley, carrying the scent of burnt wood, promethium, and pollen. He grimaced. Normally, it would have been a homely scent, spring air, the last fires of winter smoldering, and the incense of Mechanicus adepts maintaining the hold's machinery. But now it was the stench of the Hālgengas. It was bitter in his mouth. Beornwulf rubbed his half-shaven beard, the scorched patches making it uneven and rough. He would have to shave it off and let it grow back properly, if he lived that long. He glanced back at the defenses. They were as ready as they would ever be. Turning, he looked ahead, watching Cuthhelm. The seer's outstretched hand hovered over the stream that ran beneath the long bridge leading to the hold. Ice formed on the water's surface, creeping outward in delicate tendrils. It had once been a wide river by the look of it, but now it was choked with the bodies of the Hālgengas. Above him, Tunbald stood watch, his rifle held in one hand as he scanned the valley below. Beornwulf's gaze shifted back to Thranggrim. The squat seemed lost in thought. The king had wanted to stand on the bridge, to be the first to see the enemy. A ritual of battle, perhaps. Beornwulf had followed him out here, watching him carefully. If Thranggrim got himself killed in the first moments of the battle, the squats would flee, lock themselves inside KragfyrdHold, and refuse to come out. They would hold there, for a few days at most. But the roots of the Hālgengas ran deep. Deep? Roots? Something nagged at Beornwulf's mind, but he couldn't grasp it. In the valley below, there was movement, an Hālgengas nymph. They were smaller than the Thornborn, more slender, moving with the grace of a forest seer on NihtWyrtha. According to Calculus Logifexian, the nymphs were a conquered race, their bark-like flesh more flexible than their masters. Almost human, but not quite. Seers like Cuthhelm, they used their psyker abilities to conceal themselves, making them excellent scouts. The only reason Beornwulf could see it was because of his years spent trading with the forest seers of NihtWyrtha. He was no psyker, but he had learned to recognize the signs of their sorcery. His hand moved toward his weapon. The king had not noticed the nymph yet. A shot rang out. Before Beornwulf could even raise his weapon, Tunbald had fired. The round struck left of the heart, right where it would be on a human. The nymph convulsed, then collapsed into the water, twitching for a moment before going still. Cuthhelm glanced at the body but did not react in surprise. He had seen it already, had ignored it, knowing Tunbald would handle it. That made Beornwulf laugh slightly as he lowered his weapon. Thranggrim grunted in disgust, looking down at the dead nymph. Filthy Grendelkin. Those things took a lot of my squats on the first day of the war. He spat. Then, gesturing toward the body, he added, "They have chameleon cloaks." Beornwulf nodded, but did not correct him. A chameleon cloak was mechanical. The nymphs used psyker powers. But to a squat, both the warp and technology were magic. Something stirred in Beornwulf's mind again. Hiding? Chameleon? Unseen? He added it to his earlier thoughts, deep in roots. Then, strangely, an image of a bathyscaphe, a deep-diving vessel, came to mind. He shook his head. Not now. To distract himself, he asked, "What will you do when the war is over? Leave KragfyrdHold? Go back south?" By south, he meant the southern edge of the Maelstrom Reach, where the squat holds were strongest. Thranggrim spat. A squat does not leave his hearth, only to build a new one. His voice hardened. "No, I will stay. Rebuild my father's hold." Beornwulf smiled. That cheered him. There were so few friendly systems in the Arcana Inclusium. "That is good," he said. He felt the same way about his own world of water. Thranggrim's expression softened slightly, his eyes drifting to the valley below. "This world has deep bones," he said. "My great father is buried here, his father before him and his father before him. Our bones in the world's bones. It is our way." Beornwulf nodded, and then it clicked. Deep roots, hiding. His eyes snapped back to Thranggrim. "What sort of mining rigs do you have?" he asked. Thranggrim gave him a suspicious look. He did not like the smile on Beornwulf's face. A second shot rang out. Another nymph had proven it was bad at hiding, the mines of KragfyrdHold. The lift slid to a halt with little effort, its gravitation engines well maintained by the squat adepts. As the doors parted, King Thranggrim stepped forward, surveying the vast hall before him. He raised his arms wide, his voice echoing across the chamber's high walls. "My hold." His tone was heavy with pride, grief, and weariness. Beornwulf and Grimhelm stepped out after him, followed by Calculus Logifexian, whose optics whirred softly as he scanned the chamber. Behind them, two of the king's hearth guards stood by the lift, axes clenched in case any enemy had pursued them. Thranggrim moved forward, the two Wigathane warriors flanking him, the Adeptus Mechanicus priest following with interest. This was only the mining head of the hold. Yet before them stretched a vast cavern illuminated by an artificial glow, a remnant of Dark Age technology long preserved by the squats. Ahead, the faux daylight revealed a cultivated oasis, small orchards, sturdy wooden benches, and even a waterfall cascading into a stone basin. The gardens had been built for squat height, their design practical yet serene, but this was not their destination. To one side loomed a great hall, its roof so high it vanished into darkness. At its base lay a massive stone sarcophagus, the resting place of the fallen king. Around it, dozens of caskets lined the walls, the recently fallen laid to rest in solemn silence. Beornwulf and Grimhelm exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening. This small colony's losses were a reminder of what their own world might one day face. They moved deeper, descending through the lower tunnels, where the rock ceiling forced them to walk with heads bowed, the passages built for squat stature rather than human height. Beornwulf had visited Nithelm many times, and as they walked, he noted the similarities in the cavern layout and architecture. It reminded him of his homeworld's moon. For a moment, he wondered if Brother Castor's theory was true, that Nithelm had once been a squat-held moon, abandoned in the distant past. But he had no time for that now. As they walked, Calculus Logi Fexion emitted excited chirps and squeaks in Binaric, his augmetics scanning every piece of ancient squat technology. To him, this hold was a treasure trove. Not an STC, no, but a forgotten archive of lost ingenuity. He moved with diligence, cataloging each machine, already making mental notes on what he would report back to Fiskballa Station. They passed an area of recent excavation, where a massive device, nearly the size of an Astartes tank, sat wedged beneath the low ceiling. Beornwulf ran a hand along its surface, feeling the pipes, cables, and pistons, before kneeling to examine the massive barrel, extending nearly half the length of an ironclad. His brow furrowed. "A lance cannon," he murmured, incredulous. Why, he wondered, would such a weapon be underground? Thrangram let out a short laugh. "Not quite. It's a mining laser." Grimhelm let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "All the same," the Wigathan warrior said, taking in the sheer scale of the device. "A dozen of these on the surface, and the Ulgarith would have had a bad time." Thrangrim's momentary amusement faded. His jaw tightened. "We had 40 on the surface." His voice was heavy, tinged with melancholy. "They were wiped out in the first orbital bombardment." Beornwulf and Grimhelm exchanged another glance. "Lances did nothing to their bioships," Thrangrim continued bitterly. "Those things are like Leviathan Ents. Their wooden hulls just scorch." He moved to the rock face, gesturing at the smoothly melted tunnel wall, showing how efficient the mining laser was against stone, but not against the foe they faced now. "They landed pods first," the king went on. "The nymphs took out our outer colonies before the guard could be raised. Then their landing ships came." He spat. "They have no honor." Fexion adjusted his auspex, his optics flickering. "It has considerable power levels, and you had many of these on the surface?" He tilted his head slightly. "How did you generate the energy required to maintain them?" Thrangram gestured for them to follow deeper into the tunnels. They entered a long cavern, still low enough to force them to keep their heads bent. Along the length of the chamber, lined as far as the lumen strips reached, were rows of strange machines. Each device was 5 feet by 9 feet, a haphazard yet functional construction of steel, copper, and glass pipes. Each one emitted a steady hum, the static charge thick in the air. Beornwulf's eyes narrowed as he studied them. Then realization dawned. Imperial power generators. Each one had been turned on its side, flattened to fit within the confined tunnels, their coolant pipes rerouted in a way that was both genius and utterly unconventional. He wasn't a priest of the Mechanicus, but even he could appreciate the skill that had gone into their modification. Fexion was beside himself. The energy output of the motive force in these alone could power a city. His voice held reverence, his fingers twitching as if desperate to document every last detail. Thrangram nodded slowly. Then, without another word, he led them onward, toward their true goal. They descended long flights of steps, carved into the stone with perfect, machine-cut angles. Beside them, a sloped ramp, lined with massive cogwheels and heavy iron chains, allowed the transport of ores and great devices from the depths. The air grew thicker, warmer, the scent of damp rock and engine oil mixing with the faint tang of metallic dust. A low tremor rumbled through the stone. Grimhelm halted, placing a gauntleted hand against the wall, feeling the shudder ripple through the rock. "The battle above reaches down here," he muttered. Thrangram grunted. "No, maybe a heavy macro cannon hit." He shook his head. "But more likely that's the tremor from their big bioships." Beornwulf turned to him sharply. "Grendel ships?" Thrangram nodded, grim-faced. When their bioships fly too close to a planet, their grav fields pull slightly on the crust. You don't feel it on the surface, but down here? He tapped the rock underfoot with his boot. You can almost sense the passage of their void ships. The Grendelkin must be getting reinforcements. Bjornwolf looked up at the low cavern ceiling. If that were true, then the Hālgengas fleet was about to reinforce their ground forces. They had little time left. At last, they reached the level they had aimed for. Here, the cavern expanded, allowing them to finally stand at full height. Grimhelm let out a long whistle, his eyes widening. Bjornwolf's brow furrowed as he scanned the chamber, normally reserved, rubbed his chin, muttering, "Vague word." Behind them, Calculus Logifexion stood frozen, his optics flickering wildly as if overwhelmed. His servo limbs trembled, and for a moment Bjornwolf thought the Magos might actually drop to his knees in adulation before the machine god. Thrangram let out a low rumbling laugh, pleased by their expressions. Before them stood a row of 7 mole tanks, ancient armored tunneling vehicles, their massive drill heads blackened with centuries of dust and ore. Mole tanks were legendary war machines built during the Dark Age of technology, an era when humanity's understanding of engineering surpassed that of the present-day Mechanicus. Originally designed for deep mining and excavation, these vehicles had quickly found a purpose in war, becoming the ultimate siege breakers. With adamantium-plated drill heads and fusion-powered boring mechanisms, mole tanks were capable of tunneling beneath enemy fortifications, emerging behind defenses, and unleashing devastation from within. Few still existed in the current era. Most had been lost to time, destroyed in the Horus Heresy, or hoarded by Mechanicus sects who barely understood their function. But here, in KragfyrdHold, 7 fully operational mole tanks sat waiting, dormant but untouched by war. Bjornwolf stepped forward, running a hand along the armored hull of the nearest tank. Its plating was scarred but intact, and the great drill head at its front was larger than the battering rams used to break fortress gates. "These," he whispered, glancing back at Thrangram. "Why are they just sitting here?" Thrangram folded his arms, his beard shifting as he smirked. "Because they weren't meant for war. These were for deep core mining, opening new tunnels beneath the hold. They were never meant to be weapons." Grimhelm chuckled, stepping around the massive machine. "All the same," he muttered, "get 7 of these to the surface, and the Hālgengas will have a bad time." Thrangram's smirk faded. His jaw clenched, hands tightening into fists. "You of NihtWyrtha really are mad, aren't you?" Bjornwolf shrugged, gesturing toward Phexion, who had already moved along the row of dormant mole tanks, his auspex humming as it scanned their systems. The tech priest's optics flickered, his mechadendrites twitching with anticipation. "All have low power levels," Phexion reported, "but still enough to operate." Bjornwolf nodded. "Can you operate them?" Phexion tilted his head as if offended by the question. "Their motive force systems are the same as the Bathyscapium on NihtWyrtha." Bjornwolf grinned. Thrangram, however, narrowed his eyes. "If you think you can pilot one, by all means do. But what will one tank do against an invasion force?" He shook his head. "All my adepts are on the surface, and even if I had them, I don't think we have the crew to man all of them." Phexion smiled, his mechadendrites coiling like eager serpents. "For squats, maybe, but squat's understanding of the spirit machines of Mars is nothing compared to that of a Mechanicus adept." Thrangram still looked unconvinced, his brow furrowed, trying to piece together whatever half-mad strategy Bjornwolf was devising. Bjornwolf, however, simply slapped the squat king on the back with a booming laugh. "On NihtWyrtha," he said, "we just call it magic." The battle for KragfyrdHold. The ground shook with each thundering step of the Hālgengas bio-titans. Sinwolf kept his shield high, shielding himself from the rain of dart pods showering the trench line. He risked a glance over the top. The surviving Skitarii were falling back, retreating under a hail of projectiles. A Mechanicus Skitarius, caught in the open, was struck in an unarmored joint. His scream was cut short as a massive, multi-petaled flower erupted from his chest. He clawed at it, but before he could pull it free, 2 more blooms burst from his back. He collapsed, his body convulsing as roots burrowed deep into his flesh. The Ent Bio-Titans had closed on the defenders, with Thornborn infantry advancing beneath their massive root-like feet. The Skitarii firing lines opened up, their long-range radium rounds tearing through the hordes. But against the Titans themselves, the shots did little, only burning their bark-like armor but not stopping them. The Serpenta pistols cut into the Thornborn, felling dozens, but it wasn't enough. Then the Titans launched their seed pods. From their colossal limbs, they cast spore pods and seed darts into the sky, raining them down upon the Skitarii ranks. For a few moments, their reflector fields held, but the sheer volume of fire meant that some darts found their marks. The Skitarii lines broke, their ranks thinning as bioplasma and spores ripped into them. Braylon had done what needed to be done. Her task had been to hold the Hālgengas on the bridge, forcing them to commit to the exposed position. The iced-over river had dissuaded the Xenos from crossing the stream, funneling the Thornborn directly onto the bridge. Now it was time to fall back. "Rally," she called, her voice sharp and commanding. Her Skitarii fell back in formation, jumping over the trench line and retreating into the tunnels leading to the redoubt before the gates. The Wigathane warriors would hold the trench, while the squats on higher ground would pour fire into the concentrated enemy forces. Then, once the Hālgengas were packed tightly enough, Tiberius would carry out his assault. If all went to plan, this would be enough to break the attack, at least until the Navy could provide fire support. Braylon moved quickly, her augmetic legs carrying her with speed. She weaved between clusters of darts, her attention locked on the closest Thornborn, cutting it down in a burst of fire. She did not see the shimmering shape moving along the root-twisted parapet of the bridge. The nymph darted from cover. A long, javelin-like spear lanced through a retreating Skitarius, piercing clean through his torso. The warrior staggered, his reflector field collapsing. Before he could react, a storm of darts struck his unprotected body. Blooms erupted from his augmetics, roots pushing through flesh and steel. He let out a final gurgled breath before his body split apart, consumed by twisting vines. Braylon whipped around, firing a precise burst at the nymph. But the Xenos moved with unnatural grace, sliding between the shots like a whisper of wind. Then, in a flash, a second javelin sliced through her gun arm, severing her hand at the wrist. Her weapon clattered to the ground. She drew her power blade, ready to counterattack, but the nymph moved too quickly. It lunged forward, grabbing her remaining arm with a slender bark-like hand. Tendrils erupted from its palm, coiling around her wrist like living roots. Braylon struggled, trying to pull her seeks, but a vine pinned the hilt to her thigh. The nymph pulled her close. It spat a cloud of gossamer-like seeds directly into her face. Her rebreather saved her from inhaling them, but she felt a sharp sting in her real eye. Her vision exploded into stars. The seeds burrowed into her retina, sending a burning, itching sensation through her skull. With a roar, Sinwolf leaped forward, clearing the trench in a single bound. His shield locked forward, blade drawn. Tunbald followed, his flamer igniting a Thornborn as it impaled another Skitarius on a vine spear. Cuthhelm charged, his staff raised, an ice spike in his grip. The nymph saw Sinwolf charging and reacted instantly. With her remaining hand, she hurled a bundle of whiproots at his feet. The vines exploded outward, lashing like striking serpents. Sinwolf tried to leap over them, but the tendrils caught his legs, yanking him down hard. Tunbald did not hesitate. He vaulted over the struggling Sinwolf, dropping his flamer beside him and drawing his seeks. The nymph turned, lifting Braylon effortlessly with her one remaining hand. With a snapping motion, she threw her into the side of the bridge wall. Braylon braced, raising her arms to shield her remaining augmetic eye. She expected bone-breaking impact. Instead, her flight suddenly halted. She dropped to the ground softly, landing with only a slight impact. Tunbald slashed at the nymph. The creature whipped her arm outward to block, but his blade found its mark. A sharp crack echoed as his seek severed her root-like fingers. The nymph staggered back, tilting her head toward him. Her glowing, inhuman eyes bore into his mind. Tunbald's vision swam. Shapes formed, monsters twisted in the dark, a psychic attack. It was nothing compared to Cuthelm's tricks, when the seer would make the men feel spiders crawling beneath their armor. Tunbald snorted in defiance. He took one step forward and buried his blade in the nymph's chest, just left of where her heart would be. She seized his arm with her remaining hand. but her bark-covered face lost its vitality. Her body shuddered, lifeless, and collapsed. Braylon stood shakily, clutching her eye. She turned, and behind her, Cuthhelm stepped forward, his arm outstretched. Only now did she realize he had caught her in a telekinetic hold, breaking her fall. With a sharp breath, he exhaled a cold mist, frost spilling from his fingers. Braylon coughed, ripping off her frozen rebreather, gasping as her third lung activated. Her augmetic eye had frozen over, unable to focus, while her real eye blurred with pain. But the root seeds inside had stopped moving. Cuthhelm placed a hand on her face. She shuddered at the uncomfortable sensation of the seeds being drawn from her eye. Together they fell back as the Wigathane trench line opened fire on the advancing Olgarith. The Olgarith titans moved like gods of the forest, their massive root-bound limbs crashing onto the stone of the bridge, sending shockwaves through the battlefield. Their great bark-covered bodies glowed with eerie bioluminescence, the veins in their forms pulsing like the lifeblood of an ancient wood turned against its own nature. From their hollowed-out torsos, thick tendrils extended outward, writhing as if alive, carrying with them seed pods bloated with unnatural growth. With each swing of their colossal limbs, they cast spore pods high into the air, the clouds of bioluminescent pollen swirling like ghostly fireflies before raining down over the battlefield. Beneath them, a sea of thornborn surged forward, thousands of them, a wall of gnarled bark and sinew, their fibrous bodies rippling like the twisting branches of an unnatural grove. Their roots cracked the bridge's stone, their jagged, serrated limbs seemingly unstoppable. They marched forward in perfect silence, save for the unnerving crack of bark flesh shifting and the wet sound of sap dripping from wounds they barely acknowledged. Their bioplasma launchers unleashed volleys of burning green energy, crashing into the Wigathine's defensive lines, melting armor, burning flesh, and shattering stone. Sinwolf reloaded as another soldier screamed, struck by a seed dart in the chest. The projectile bloomed instantly, a red and gold flower bursting forth from his torso, its petals unfurling in an obscene mimicry of life. The soldier's body convulsed, roots spreading from within, piercing through his armor, entwining around his limbs, binding him to the earth like a newly planted tree. A moment later, his twitching corpse began to move again, his skeletal remains still clad in armor, now a puppet for the Olgarith's terrible harvest. Sinwolf hesitated, but Tunbald planted his seeks in the reanimated warrior's chest. He had only seen this a few times before. The Olgarith had some sort of weapon that could take over the nervous system of a dead host. The infected host was no longer truly alive. Its body twitched and jerked, moving with no intelligence, only blind instinct, a grotesque puppet strung together by parasitic roots and tendrils. He saw others doing the same, even some of the Skitarii, and he cursed. The Olgarith had not yet perfected this weapon with human physiology. Unlike the more advanced bioforms they created from their own kind, these reanimated warriors were crude, unstable, only able to stagger blindly toward living targets, seeking to ensnare others in their infection. Barbed lash whips grew from their decaying flesh, extending like grasping vines, lashing out at anything nearby. It was a terror weapon. They did not last long. Even after a few minutes, the infected stilled, their bodies unable to function as nerves and muscles deteriorated completely, and over time turned the host into a mannequin of roots and flowers. An eerie find when moving through areas assaulted by Olgarith forces, forests of living statues. Their limbs twitched involuntarily, the sap-infested corpses struggling against their own rotting frames before falling still. But in those moments, they spread panic. No warrior, no matter how hardened, could ignore the sight of their own comrades, freshly fallen, rising again to attack them. For now, the Olgarith's biosorcery was crude, limited in its effectiveness, but who knew what they could refine in the months to come? If this invasion was not halted, perhaps they would one day perfect it. Perhaps in time they would march to war with entire armies of reanimated, infected warriors, a grotesque, twisted mockery of the Imperium's dead, a nightmare waiting to be realized. Thornborn were burning, many in smoldering heaps, but for every one that fell, 10 more took its place. Then a huge bio-titan foot slammed down 20 yards away. "Fall back!" Sinwolf roared, dragging another wounded warrior away from the carnage. The Wigathane line collapsed, the soldiers retreating in disciplined groups, covering one another with short bursts of gunfire. They scrambled to the tunnels that led to the redoubt. Just then, a sound of 100 trees cracking in a storm came overhead. Tunbald pushed Sinwolf back as a massive cluster of roots slammed down into the trench. The barricade above exploded in a rain of rock, steel, and flesh, men hurled through the air like broken dolls. Tunbald barely had time to throw himself aside, rolling onto one knee, his armor scraped and battered. Seeing the place the others had been blocked, he made for the tunnels. Sinwolf, on the opposite side of the foot, was unable to see the others, but hoped they were alive. Cuthhelm grabbed his arm. "They are fine," he told him. More seed pods rained down, embedding themselves in the bodies of fallen warriors, sprouting in seconds, transforming the dead into living weapons. A Wigathine was stuck in his chest, where a rent had been torn in his breastplate, reaching for his chest as a brilliant violet flower blossomed through his armor, roots twisting through his body like a parasite devouring its host. The warrior locked eyes with Sinwolf, silent, before he lifted his weapon one final time, firing into the oncoming horde before his body collapsed, his flesh devoured from within. Cuthhelm ran along with Sinwolf, pushing the last survivors through the tunnel. Then Sinwolf turned, dropping an anti-plant grenade in the trench behind him. Moments after they fled, Thornborn dropped into the trench. They writhed as the gas, designed to clear foliage, began to burn them alive. Sinwolf scrambled through the tunnels, climbing out within the redoubt, Cuthhelm at his back. He found Tunbald waiting, who detonated the charges, bringing the tunnels down. The redoubt stood in front of the partly open hold gate, and manning the defenses of the redoubt stood the squat defenders. Sinwolf looked around. "Where is Beornwolf and the king?" he shouted. The squat captain looked down to him. "They went into the hold, not been seen since." Sinwolf wondered why they were not here, but he trusted his friend enough to know he would not abandon them. He watched Braylon been carried away, then jumped up on the redoubt wall. As far as he could see, the Ulgarith were marching like an unstoppable forest. The Thornborn flooded the ground between the observatory where the last Skitarii made their stand and the redoubt walls, the last two defensive points. He took aim and began firing. Of moles and wargs. The squats stood firm upon the redoubt wall, their sturdy figures unyielding even as the titanic forms of the Ulgarith bore down upon them. Their yellow power armor, dented and battle-worn, gleamed in the flickering firelight, the sigils of their fallen holds proudly etched into their pauldrons. Their bolters roared, autocannons thudded, and the air filled with the crackling discharge of plasma and volkite fire. They fought as their forefathers had, shoulder to shoulder, weapons locked, their feet planted upon stone that had withstood the weight of ages. Below, the Thornborn surged, their fibrous bodies writhing, climbing over their own dead in an attempt to reach the parapet. The defenders met them with cold steel and fire, slamming them back with bolt rounds and searing promethium. Yet for every creature felled, 10 more pushed forward. Then came the Titans. The first great bioform loomed over the wall, a monstrous thing of bark and sinew, its limbs like the gnarled branches of an elder tree. Its hollowed chest split open, revealing a tangle of writhing roots, and from within came the pods, living seed bombs that struck the battlements, bursting into a storm of lashing vines and toxic spores. The squats did not break. Even as the tendrils coiled around their legs, dragging some screaming into the hungry roots below, they fired until the last bolt shell was spent. Some were lifted bodily into the air by the sweeping branches of the Titans, their power armor crushed in its grasp before being hurled from the parapets. Their cries were lost in the roar of battle as they plunged into the choked river below, their bodies swallowed by the tangled mass of corpses and roots that had overtaken the waterway. Yet still, the others stood. Those who remained reloaded with steady hands, their voices bellowing defiant oaths, swearing that the Ulgarith would break before they did. A banner stood amid the carnage, its sigil defiant against the night, the fabric torn and scorched, but still unfallen. And as the horde surged again, as the Titans reached for the wall, as the sky boiled with spores and fire, the squats braced, ready to sell their lives dearly so that the holds of their ancestors might never be forgotten. Sinwolf with Cuthhelm and Toonbald fired into the lumbering ent. It towered over the redoubt, reaching down towards them with hands made of huge tree branches. Volkite and plasma rounds burnt off and snapped fingers, but they were too many. Then suddenly the ent slipped sideways, toppling over its smaller Thornborn infantry. Sinwolf frowned. What was that? Had the squats down the line blown one of its feet? He looked down, and his mouth dropped. The ground trembled beneath the redoubt, not with the distant echoes of battle, nor the relentless march of the Olgarith, but with something new, something rising from beneath. For a moment, both Squat and Olgarith paused, sensing the shift, the disturbance deep within the earth. Then the ground ruptured. A massive shockwave cracked through the stone, sending debris skyward as the first of the mole tanks emerged, its colossal drillhead bursting through the surface in an explosion of shattered rock and churned soil. The tunnel entrance widened, followed by another, then another, until 7 great machines of war rose from the depths, relics of a forgotten age. The lead tank, a hulking machine plated in adamantium and steel, erupted directly beneath an Olgarith Titan, its massive rotating drill shearing straight through the creature's root-bound legs. The Titan groaned, its bark-like armor splitting apart, luminescent sap gushing like blood as it toppled forward, only for the tank to plow through its falling body, grinding wooden sinew and unnatural flesh into ruin. Its hull burned red-hot from the sheer friction of its emergence, but its weapons were already primed. Inside the forward cabin, Bjornwolf braced against the shock of emergence, his hand gripping the restraint rail, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the battlefield from the view slit. Across from him, King Thrangrim, his power axe already humming with energy, let out a deep, rumbling laugh as he saw the havoc unfold. Outside on the hull of one of the tanks, a hatch slammed open and Grimhelm emerged first, his heavy flamer roaring to life, washing the stunned Thornborn in waves of promethium. Within the mole, Phyrexian, his mechadendrites twitching with barely contained excitement, linked into the other 6 tanks remotely, his binary cant flooding their control circuits. Only the crude mole was capable of firing its weapons, having a crew. The other 6 Phyrexian could only command as rams. Given more time, and 24 adepts, he felt sure in future this could be amended, maybe with a servitor crew of cogitators. For now, he relished the thrill of using such arcane machinery, communing with 7 machine spirits at once. The remaining mole tanks burst forth, each tearing through the enemy lines in perfect synchronization. The 6 remote-controlled tanks drove with mechanized precision, surging beneath the battlefield, erupting at strategic locations along the Olgarith advance. Each drilled through the roots of bio-titans, shearing through legs, limbs, and twisted plant-like tendrils before emerging to unleash devastation. One broke through beneath a cluster of Thornborn, its treads grinding them into pulp before spinning in place, its autocannons roaring as it cut down the survivors. Another burst out behind enemy lines, cutting off their reinforcements, its plasma weaponry scouring the battlefield in arcs of searing fire. But the most terrifying emergence came before the redoubt itself. The ground buckled and cracked. Then a great steel behemoth rose from the depths following the mole, its chassis charred but unbroken, its adamantium hull smeared with the sap and gore of its passage. The Olgarith forces turned toward it, sensing its threat, just as the front of the tank split open, revealing a mounted lance laser. Then, with a single blinding beam, the laser ignited the battlefield. The lance laser fired, a superheated spear of light, slicing through dozens of Thornborn in an instant. In orbital defense against bioships in Void, they may not have been effective, but point blank, it was like a constant bolt of flame. The beam raked across the field, carving scorched ruin through the enemy lines, reducing hordes of Olgarith warriors to blackened husks. A Titan turned, attempting to shield itself with a raised limb, but the beam pierced straight through it, severing its arm from its body, the wound boiling from within before the creature collapsed into a smoldering heap. From the redoubt walls, the remaining squats let out a cheer, renewed by the sight of their ancestors' lost war machines returned to the fight. Oath fulfilled. Within the armored observatory, Magos Doctora Cogitatus Tiberius permitted himself a brief, calculated smile. The counterattack had been planned with meticulous precision, his cogitators running countless battle simulations with King Thrangrim's input. However, a company of mole tanks had not been part of the original strategy. When Bornwolf had come to him with the idea, Tiberius had initially dismissed it, assuming the man was suffering from combat-induced stress, his techno-barbarian mind struggling to comprehend the scale of galactic war. Yet King Thrangrim had supported the plan, and Tiberius had noted something interesting about the new squat king. He was much like his father, King Durgrun, a pragmatic risk-taker, willing to gamble everything if the rewards were great enough. And now, as the battlefield burned, the mole tanks thundered forward, and the Hālgengas reeled, it seemed that madness and pragmatism had for once aligned. Tiberius raised his power axe, a signal encoded in a single motion. With a deep metallic groan, the gates of the observatory yawned open, and he charged into the fray. Wyrkung, Thenkung, and Daemung, his great wargs, had been denied the hunt for too long. They burst forward, their red-plated armor gleaming, fangs bared in anticipation. For hours they had stood before the closed gates, their claws scratching deep gouges into the reinforced floor, their snarls rising as they sensed battle beyond their reach. Now they were unleashed. Behind him, 300 Skitarii, hiding within the observatory, emerged in perfect formation. Weapons snapped into firing positions, radium bursts and plasma fire streaked through the smoke, tearing into the Xenos' ranks. At the same time, to the left of the redoubt, another force rose from the wreckage. From within the shattered remains of a squat land train, destroyed in the first hours of the war, the Wigathane launched their ambush. Serpentas roared, heavy stubbers sang, and their fire cut across the battlefield, catching the Thornborn in a lethal crossfire. As they advanced, they hurled their last reserves of anti-plant grenades, the explosions splitting bark, while plasma rounds boiled through Hālgengas bodies. Thenkung and Daemung tore through the nearest Thornborn, ignoring the spore pods bursting against their thick fur and armor. The Hālgengas warriors fired their darts, but they bounced harmlessly off their red-plated hides. With a single swipe, Thenkung's claws split open a Thornborn's glowing core, sap spilling onto the ground as the Xenos collapsed in a twitching heap. Daemung tore through another, his jaws clamping down on its weapon limb, ripping it clean off before tossing it aside like broken kindling. But Wyrkung, the pack leader, had his eyes set on greater prey. Wyrkung barreled through the battlefield, plowing through Hālgengas warriors like an unstoppable force. His target loomed ahead, a massive bio-titan, its great bark-armored form bristling with parasitic weapons. On its upper platform, within a gnarled bowl of twisted wood and jagged teeth, stood a contingent of nymphs, firing javelins and psychic blasts down onto the battlefield. Wyrkung clawed his way up the titan, his armored paws finding purchase on the massive wooden limbs, his snarl vibrating deep in his throat. The nymphs turned their focus toward him, their warp-fueled attacks lashing out, but Wyrkung did not slow. These feeble mind tricks were nothing to a predator born and raised on NihtWyrtha. He reached the summit and tore through the nymph warriors, ripping them apart. The first fell to his snapping jaws, its bark flesh crushed between his fangs. The second tried to strike, but Wyrkung slammed it down onto the jagged bowl, its own weapon impaling it. The third tried to flee, but Wyrkung pounced, and its screams were lost beneath his crushing bite. Then he turned his fury upon the Titan itself. Wyrkung lunged forward, sinking his teeth into the sensory array of the great bio-machine. His claws tore into the thick knots of vines that acted as rudimentary nerves, ripping them out one by one. The Titan shuddered, its limbs twitching, sap pouring from its wounds. With one final snarl, Wyrkung buried his fangs deep, tearing out the last of its sensory clusters, reducing the great behemoth to a mindless husk. The massive bio-titan lurched, its remaining strength fading. Then, with a final groaning creak, it toppled sideways, its colossal body crashing into the battlefield below. A rain of shattered bark and sap coated the ground. The shockwave sent Hālgengas warriors flying, crushed beneath the weight of their own fallen god. Tiberius caught up to his wargs, his power axe crackling with energy. The Skitarii lines moved in perfect synchronization, marching across the field, their firepower cutting down the remaining Xenos forces. The Wigathine pressed forward, their bolt fire relentless, pushing the surviving Olgarith back toward the ruins of their failed assault. Tiberius watched as Wyrkung landed upon a stunned Thornborn, the beast tearing its throat out with one savage motion. He nodded approvingly, raising his axe once more. Tiberius ripped his power axe free from the sundered remains of a Thornborn, sap and shredded bark dripping from its blade. He pressed forward, each calculated swing carving through the remaining Xenos warriors, pushing toward the broken front line. Then, a massive impact shook the battlefield. The lead mole tank shuddered and halted, an Ent Bio-Titan's massive foot slamming down onto its reinforced hull. The colossal war machine did not crumple. It had been forged to hold the weight of the world upon it, but the impact had snapped its track links, rendering it immobile. From the disabled turret, Beornwulf climbed up, his Serpenta drawn, a chainsword roaring in his other hand. Beside him, King Thrangram leaped from the ruined hull, his axe already burying itself into an Olgarith warrior's chest. The creature twitched, sap bubbling from its sundered core, before Thrangram wrenched the weapon free, its lifeless husk collapsing. Grimhelm followed, his flamer sending arcs of fire into the retreating mass, scorching the wounded Olgarith where they crawled. Through the thick of the fighting, Tiberius advanced, his red-armored form parting the battlefield like a force of nature. An oath fulfilled, the Magos declared, his voice metallic through his augmetics. Thrangram let out a bark of laughter, swinging his axe over his shoulder as he looked toward the redoubt. From the fortifications, the squats had seen their king's charge, and they would not be outdone. Their battle oaths thundered across the field, the name of their new ruler carried on the wind as they poured over the redoubt walls, crushing the retreating Olgarith beneath a wave of fury. At their head, Sinwulf led the charge, his blades slick with sap, his shield raised high. Beside him, Braylin moved, her arm in a sling, a bandage covering one of her eyes, but still marching forward. Beornwulf cut down a wounded Olgarith warrior with a sweeping strike of his chainsword, then turned, seeing the pair approaching. "I told you to stay out of trouble," he called to Braylin. She smiled, her expression sheepish despite her injuries. "You said you'd be back shortly," she replied dryly. He huffed a laugh, shaking his head, but his smile faded as he looked around the battlefield. The Olgarith were in full retreat, their assault broken. The bridge had been reclaimed. Beornwulf stood, panting, his muscles aching, as he took a moment to survey the carnage. Beside him, Sinwulf remained vigilant, standing guard while Beornwulf checked Braylin's wounds. She would be fine, by the look of it. Turning, he saw Thrangram standing upon the bridge, exactly where he had been at the start of the battle. But this time, standing beside him, General Tiberius gazed out over the ruins. The great gates of the hold still stood. He had fulfilled his oath. The battlefield was theirs. Across the field, the Skitarii, Squats, and Wigathen pursued the fleeing Xenos, burning the stragglers, ensuring that none would regrow from the ruin. Of the 21 Ents that had marched upon the redoubt, only 3 still lived, their crippled forms dragging themselves away, sap leaking in thick streams from their shattered limbs. The rest were nothing more than burning heaps, piles of shattered branches and bioluminescent core matter soaking into the ground. The warriors who remained standing looked to the bridge, to the king of KragfyrdHold, and the leaders who had brought them victory. Thrangram saw Beornwulf approaching, the warrior caked in sap and soot, and nodded. "Yes, utter bastards," he said with a grin, his voice still carrying the ferocity of battle. Then, turning to Braylin, he saluted her, his respect clear. Finally, his gaze returned to Beornwulf. "My hold is in NihtWyrtha's debt. I owe you an oath now, and I pay my debts." But even as he spoke, his eyes wandered over the ruins of his home, his expression lightening. He had fought for survival, but in doing so, he had witnessed the rise of a new power, and he knew what it meant. Beornwulf nodded, wiping sap from his armor as the others moved through the wreckage of the Olgarith Ents. Nearby, Tiberius stood in silence, his wargs seated around him, their ears flicking as they searched for remaining threats. His gaze was locked upon the sky, scanning the heavy clouds above. Beornwulf followed his line of sight, understanding the unspoken tension that gripped the general's frame. For all they had won here, for all the Olgarith had lost, the void above still held danger. And if the novice Astra Wigathane could not hold the skies, if they fell, then all of this, all of their sacrifices would be for nothing. Through the smoke-filled sky he imagined the fleet of bioships moving towards KragfyrdHold, and he was powerless to do anything about it.